The dinner conversation that would change my life forever started innocently enough. It was a typical Sunday evening in March 2019, and I was sitting around my parents' dining room table in Charlotte, North Carolina, with my younger brother Jake and his girlfriend Amy. At 28, I'd been living at home for 6 months while rebuilding my career after being laid off from a tech startup. Mom had made her famous pot roast, and we were celebrating Jake's recent promotion to senior analyst at his accounting firm. At 25, Jake had always been the golden child. Honors graduate, immediate job placement, life perfectly mapped out. "Congratulations, Jake," I said, raising my glass. "That promotion is well-deserved." "Thanks, sis. It comes with a nice salary bump, so Amy and I are finally going to start looking at houses. We found this amazing neighborhood in South Charlotte." "That's wonderful," Mom gushed. "We're so proud of how responsible you've become. 25 and already ready to buy a house." The familiar knot formed in my stomach as the conversation revolved around Jake's achievements while I struggled to find my footing. "What about you, Emma?" Amy asked. "Any exciting career developments?" I'd been dreading this question. While Jake climbed the corporate ladder, I'd been working as a freelance marketing consultant after my entire department was eliminated overnight. I'm still building my consulting business. I have several clients and interesting projects. It's nice having the flexibility. Dad set down his fork and fixed me with that patronizing look. "Emma, don't you think it's time to be realistic? You're 28, living at home, working odd jobs, and calling it a business. When are you going to get serious?" "Dad, freelance marketing consulting is legitimate. I'm building valuable experience." "You're building excuses," he interrupted. "Jake has a real job with benefits and a clear path. You're playing pretend entrepreneur while being supported by us." "I pay rent, Dad. I contribute to expenses." "Temporarily?" His eyebrows rose. "You've been saying that for 6 months. Meanwhile, your brother is buying a house because he made responsible choices." I felt my cheeks burning. Everyone's path is different. Just because I'm not following Jake's timeline doesn't mean— "What goals?" He cut me off harshly. "Emma, you need to hear this. You've been drifting for years, changing jobs, boyfriends, plans. You're nearly 30 with nothing to show for it. No career, no savings, no house, no husband. When do you admit your approach isn't working?" The silence was deafening. I forced myself to stay composed despite the tears threatening to spill. "I'm not drifting, Dad. I'm adapting. I'm building something meaningful." "Emma, you're 28 and living in your childhood bedroom. That's not adapting. That's failing to launch. And frankly, it's becoming a burden on your mother and me." The word burden hit like a physical blow. Hearing it stated so bluntly was devastating. "A burden," I repeated quietly. Dad's expression softened slightly. "Emma, I didn't mean—" "No, you did mean it." I stood up, legs unsteady. "You think I'm a burden, a failure. You think I'll never amount to anything because I'm not following Jake's exact path. That's not what your father meant," Mom said weakly. "He's just worried. He's embarrassed by me," I said, the truth finally spoken. Embarrassed that his daughter doesn't fit his definition of success. I looked directly at my father. "You don't have to worry about me being a burden much longer. I'll figure it out." I walked out and up to my childhood bedroom, closing the door with deliberate calm. Once alone, I finally allowed myself to cry. But as tears subsided, determination took their place. Dad thought I was a burden, thought I'd never amount to anything, thought I'd never own a house like Jake. He saw my situation as permanent failure rather than temporary circumstances. That night, I opened my laptop and began researching senior marketing positions at larger companies. I'd been hesitant to jump back into corporate life, preferring freelancing autonomy, but maybe it was time for a strategic move. As I updated my resume, I made a promise. I was going to show my father exactly what I was capable of. I was going to prove that his burden could achieve everything he thought was beyond my reach. I had no idea that within 18 months, I'd be buying the exact house that sparked this conversation, and that my father would confront just how wrong he'd been about his daughter's potential. 3 weeks after that devastating dinner, I received a call that would change everything. Jennifer Martinez, the VP of Marketing at TechFlow Solutions, one of Charlotte's fastest-growing software companies, wanted to interview me for their new Director of Digital Marketing position. I'd applied on a whim after seeing the job posting on LinkedIn. The role was a significant step up from anything I'd done before, but my freelance work had given me experience across multiple industries and digital platforms that larger companies valued. "Emma, your portfolio is impressive," Jennifer said during our phone screening. "The campaign you designed for that healthcare startup increased their lead generation by 340%. That's exactly the kind of innovative thinking we need here." The interview process was intense, 3 rounds including a presentation to the executive team. But something had shifted in me since Dad's burden comment. I approached each conversation with a confidence I'd never felt before, fueled by determination to prove my worth. 2 weeks later, Jennifer called with an offer that left me speechless. $95,000 base salary, full benefits, equity options, and a $10,000 signing bonus. It was nearly double what I'd been making as a consultant, and more than Jake earned at his stable accounting job. We see tremendous potential in you, Emma. This role could lead to VP within 2 years if you perform as we expect. I accepted immediately, then sat in my childhood bedroom staring at the offer letter. The same bedroom where Dad had implied I was failing at life now contained proof of my potential he'd refused to see. The hardest part was telling my family. That Sunday dinner, I waited until dessert to share my news. I have an announcement, I said, setting down my coffee cup. I got a job offer from TechFlow Solutions. I'm their new director of digital marketing. Mom's face lit up. Emma, that's wonderful. Congratulations. Dad looked skeptical. What's the salary? $95,000, plus benefits and equity. The silence that followed was deafening. Jake nearly choked on his pie. Dad's expression shifted from skepticism to confusion. That's more than I make, Jake said quietly. It's a good start, Dad said carefully, clearly struggling to process this development. But Emma, director positions come with pressure. Are you sure you're ready for that level of responsibility? Even in the face of my success, he couldn't simply be proud. There had to be a caveat, a concern, a reason why this achievement wasn't quite legitimate. I'm ready, Dad. I've been preparing for this my entire career, even when it didn't look traditional. My first month at TechFlow was a whirlwind. I inherited a team of 5 marketers and a struggling digital presence that needed complete restructuring. Working 12-hour days, I dove into analytics, rewrote their content strategy, and launched 3 new campaigns simultaneously. By month 3, our lead generation had increased 180%. By month 6, I'd secured the largest client in company history, a $1 million contract that made the local business news. My parents saw the article. Dad called that evening, his voice different than I'd heard in years. Emma, I saw the piece in the Charlotte Observer. That's quite an achievement. Thank you, Dad. I may have misjudged your potential. It was the closest thing to an apology I'd gotten, but I was too focused on my next goal to dwell on family validation. I'd started house hunting, specifically in that South Charlotte neighborhood Jake had mentioned, the one he'd said was perfect for young professionals ready to settle down. The irony wasn't lost on me. While Jake and Amy were still looking at houses 6 months later, apparently his promotion hadn't come with as large a salary bump as he'd hoped. I was getting pre-approved for a mortgage that would let me buy exactly what he'd described as his dream home. My loan officer, Mrs. Chen, reviewed my financials with obvious approval. Miss Williams, with your salary and credit score, you qualify for up to $380,000. That'll get you a beautiful home in the areas you're considering. $380,000. More than my father's annual salary. Enough to buy a house in the neighborhood he'd probably never be able to afford, based on a career he'd dismissed as playing pretend entrepreneur just 8 months earlier. As I drove through South Charlotte that weekend, looking at open houses and the very development Jake had shown me on his phone, I realized I wasn't just proving my father wrong. I was rewriting the entire narrative of who I was supposed to be in our family. The house hunting process revealed something unexpected. I wasn't just buying a home, I was buying my independence from their opinions, their timelines, their definitions of success. For the first time in my adult life, I was operating completely on my own terms. And I was just getting started. The house was everything Jake had described and more. A stunning colonial in the Stonehaven development. 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, gourmet kitchen with granite countertops, hardwood floors throughout, and a backyard that backed up to a small lake. The listing price was $365,000, well within my budget, and it had been on the market for only 3 days. This is the one, I told my realtor, Sarah, as we walked through the master suite with its walk-in closet and spa-like bathroom. I want to make an offer. Are you sure? Sarah asked. You've only looked at 5 houses. Don't you want to see more options? No, this is perfect. What I didn't tell Sarah was that this was the exact house Jake had bookmarked on Zillow 8 months earlier. The one he'd shown me photos of during that fateful dinner. The same house he'd said was perfect for young professionals ready to settle down. Before Dad had called me a burden, who would never amount to anything. I made a full-price offer that afternoon. With my pre-approval letter, strong credit score, and willingness to close quickly, the sellers accepted within hours. 3 weeks later, I was signing closing documents on my first home. The timing was perfect. TechFlow had just promoted me to senior director with a $15,000 raise after I'd secured 2 more major clients. At 29, I was earning $110,000 annually, owned a beautiful home, and had become one of the youngest senior directors in the company's history. I waited until the following Sunday dinner to share my news. As usual, the conversation centered around Jake and Amy's ongoing house search. They'd been looking seriously for over a year now, but something always seemed to prevent them from making an offer. The down payment wasn't quite ready, the location wasn't perfect, or Amy wanted to wait for something better. "We saw another beautiful place in Stonehaven yesterday," Amy was saying. "4 bedrooms, lakeview, gorgeous kitchen, but it's a bit outside our price range." "Stonehaven is a wonderful neighborhood," Mom agreed. "I heard the schools are excellent there." "Which house was it?" I asked innocently. Jake pulled out his phone and showed me a photo. "This colonial on Maple Creek Drive. The listing price is $365,000, but we'd probably need to offer more to be competitive." I smiled, recognizing my own front door in the photo. "Actually, that house sold 3 weeks ago." "Oh, that's too bad," Amy said disappointedly. "It was exactly what we were looking for." "I know," I said, setting down my water glass. "I bought it." The silence that followed was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Jake's phone slipped from his hand and clattered onto the table. Amy's mouth fell open. Mom's fork froze halfway to her mouth. Dad stared at me as if I'd announced I was moving to Mars. "You bought a house?" Mom finally managed. "Yes. I closed last Friday. I've been wanting to tell you in person. The $365,000 house?" Jake's voice was barely a whisper. "That's the one. 4 bedrooms, 3 baths, granite counters, hardwood floors, and the most amazing lake view from the master bedroom." Dad found his voice first. "Emma, how could you possibly afford a house like that? The down payment alone would be $73,000, I finished, "which I saved from my salary and the performance bonuses I've been earning. Plus, I got a great interest rate because of my credit score and debt-to-income ratio." "But that's impossible," Jake said, shaking his head. "I make good money, and Amy works too, but we've been saving for 2 years and still don't have enough for a house like that." "Actually, Jake, I make more than both of you combined now. I got another promotion last month. I'm Senior Director of Digital Marketing, earning $110,000 base plus bonuses." The second silence was even more profound than the first. My family sat frozen, processing information that completely contradicted their understanding of who I was and what I was capable of. $110,000? Dad repeated slowly. Plus bonuses. Last quarter alone, I earned an extra $8,000 because my campaigns exceeded performance targets. Amy looked between Jake and me with obvious confusion. "But Emma, a year ago you were living at home, working as a freelance consultant, being called a burden," I finished gently. I remember. Dad's face had gone pale. I could see him calculating, comparing, realizing that his successful son's accounting salary was barely 2/3 of what his failure daughter was now earning. "I don't understand," he said quietly. "How did this happen so fast?" "It didn't happen fast, Dad. I spent years building skills, learning from different clients, developing expertise that bigger companies value. When you called me a burden, I wasn't failing. I was preparing for an opportunity you couldn't see coming." Jake slumped in his chair, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. "Emma, I had no idea. We all thought, I know what you thought, that I was drifting, making excuses, avoiding responsibility. But I was actually building something you didn't recognize because it looked different from your path." Mom reached across the table and touched my hand. "Honey, we owe you an apology. We clearly didn't understand what you were accomplishing." "You don't owe me anything, Mom. But maybe next time, trust that people can be successful in ways that don't fit your timeline or expectations." I looked directly at my father, who hadn't spoken since learning about my salary. "Dad, you were worried I'd never own a home, never have a real career, never contribute anything meaningful. I just wanted you to know that the burden you were worried about has figured it out." As I drove home that evening to my beautiful house with its lake view and granite countertops, I realized something had fundamentally shifted. I was no longer seeking their approval or trying to prove my worth. I'd simply become the person I'd always had the potential to be, once I stopped letting their limitations define my possibilities. The girl who'd been called a burden had bought the exact house her successful brother could only dream about. But the real victory wasn't the house. It was the knowledge that I'd built a life completely on my own terms. 6 months later, I hosted my first family dinner in my new home. As I watched Dad admire the granite countertops he'd once thought were beyond my reach, I reflected on how dramatically our relationship had changed. "Emma, this kitchen is incredible," Mom said, running her hands along the breakfast bar. "You've really made something special here." Jake and Amy had finally bought a modest townhouse across town. Nice, but nothing like the Stonehaven colonial they'd dreamed about. Jake seemed genuinely happy for me now, though though I caught him occasionally looking around my house with a mixture of admiration and bewilderment. "I keep meaning to ask," he said as we prepared dinner together. "How did you know you could do this? How did you have so much confidence when none of us believed in you?" I didn't have confidence, Jake. I had desperation. When Dad called me a burden, I realized I had two choices: prove him right or prove him wrong. The fear of being seen as a failure forever was stronger than my fear of taking risks. Dad appeared in the kitchen doorway, having been unusually quiet all evening. "Emma, can we talk privately for a minute?" We stepped out onto my deck overlooking the lake, the same view Jake had shown me in that Zillow photo over a year ago. "I owe you more than an apology," Dad said, his voice thick with emotion. "I owe you an admission that I was completely wrong about who you are and what you're capable of." "Dad, no, let me finish. I spent so many years comparing you to Jake, measuring your worth by his timeline, that I missed seeing your actual strengths. I called you a burden when you were actually the most resilient person in our family." He gestured toward the house behind us. "You're 29 years old and you've achieved more than I did by 40. Not just financially, but professionally, personally. You've built something extraordinary, and you did it despite my doubts, not because of my support. You were protecting me the only way you knew how," I said. "But Dad, protection and limitation aren't the same thing. I know that now. I also know that calling you a burden was the worst thing I've ever said to one of my children. You weren't a burden. You were finding your way, and I was too impatient and narrow-minded to see it." As we rejoined the family for dinner, I looked around my dining room table. The same faces, but completely different dynamics. I was no longer the struggling daughter living at home. I was the successful host welcoming my family into the life I'd built. "I want to make a toast," Dad said, raising his wine glass, "to Emma, who taught us that success doesn't follow a single path, and that sometimes the people we underestimate the most are the ones with the greatest potential." "To Emma," everyone echoed. But the real toast was internal. To the girl who'd refused to accept someone else's definition of her limitations, who'd turned the word burden into fuel for transformation, and who'd learned that sometimes the greatest gift you can give yourself is the refusal to be smaller than your dreams. The house was beautiful, the career was rewarding, but the real victory was simpler. I'd become exactly who I was meant to be, regardless of anyone else's timeline or expectations.